a lot of people aren't familiar with, for good reason. It didn't exactly get the best reception when it came out, and well, it's memorable in a few strange ways, but incredibly forgettable in others. Coming out in 1993 as a TV movie on NBC, this film is incredibly loosely, based on Charles Dickens' classic 1850 novel of the same name, David Copperfield. It cut out a few characters while drastically changing the rest and was, well, a bit of an odd one, even for the time it came out. It starts out with a cat, because they're all animals in this Robin Hood style. The cat carrying gifts and trying to get through the busy streets of the town of Blunderstone to see her niece, Clara, who is giving birth to her son. This movie was the first time I ever saw an animated character actually in labor, or any hint that it was painful. I knew what birth was like because I'd assisted with it in Animals plenty by the time I saw this movie, and I knew it wasn't a walk in the park. But I'd never seen it shown to hurt on TV before, especially in animation. They always just kind of disappeared into a hospital room and reappeared with a baby as if they'd Star Trek beamed it out. We see the two villainous characters, Edward Murdstone and his sidekick Grimby, kidnapping kids off the street for slave labor in their factories, including a kid who looks a lot like a character we meet later, even though when we meet him then, he seems to be about the same age as David, who is being born right now. Well, reusing animation styles and character designs is nothing new, especially in cheaper animation. They also stop by Clara Copperfield's house, Murdstone making his intent to marry Clara and take her fortunes for himself quite clear. David is born, and is a boy, much to his aunt's chagrin, who sings the first real song of the movie, a song about how much boys suck, that absolutely does not fit the Victorian-era style the film was largely going for. It's kind of hilarious, really. She promises to leave and never come back, as she only wants to have girls in the family. She hates men as a whole, and boys by the virtue that they grow up to be men. I'm going to guess that she had some bad experiences with men, but they never really delve into her backstory here and changed so much about all the characters that what holds true in the original may not have anything to do with her motivations here. She leaves, so David is raised by his mother Clara and a housemaid, Mrs. Peggotty. Clara expresses worry that he'll need a male figure in his life someday, which gives Murdstone his opening. We skip forward several years until David is a teenager. It seems that Murdstone had been putting the moves on his mother for a while, and Clara is falling for his attempts to act fatherly towards David, even if they're painfully obviously motivated by wanting her money, and he's trying to push David away from his mother and direct him towards factory working and manual labor, rather than the more scholarly pursuits and music that David actually cares about. David has even learned the harpsichord on his own, which is pretty impressive. It's not an easy instrument to learn at all. Singing a song to his mother about being her hero and how she doesn't need any other men in her life. Honestly, this goes well into creep territory. His mother in the song sequence is more fashioned like a love interest to the characters he's acting as, with him defeating a Murdstone dragon to save her. Later on, his love interest looks almost identical to his mother, which you could argue is just that the cat characters all look the same except for Murdstone, but there are at least a few differences that stand out a little between David, his mother, and his aunt. But his love interest, the Duke's daughter Agnes, looks almost exactly like his mother, except that she has hair, and the way that he talks to her is just like how he talks to his mother. Kinda creepy. Murdstone and Clara get married, much to David's disgust, which he expresses a lot, with Clara developing the telltale tragic cough, soon to turn much worse. Murdstone of course wants her out of the way so he can get her money, so he refuses to have a doctor come check on her. Now, from what we see of how he spends his time after he takes David to the factory, he's hardly ever there with her at her house. He's pretty much at the factory all the time, presumably having living quarters there or nearby. So, why didn't Peggotty or David call the doctor themselves? Sure, Murdstone could get mad about it, but he couldn't actually deny her treatment without it being painfully obvious to everyone what he was trying to do, even to blissfully oblivious Clara. who could reach out to her man-hating aunt, who would likely be all too glad to show up and beat Murdstone into an early grave with whatever heavy object was handy. But no, Clara doesn't stand up for anyone, not even her own son, who she lets be dragged off by Murdstone to work in his factory as slave labor. Yes, he reveals the fact that he kidnaps orphans to use as slave labor in his cheese factory to a well-read, high-born young man who already hates him, who has nothing to lose and everything to gain by exposing him. And it's not like no one knows that David is there and he can keep him hidden away forever. Clara knows, the doctor knows, Peggotty knows. Anyone familiar with their family would know that David exists and at some point would want to see or talk to him, and the moment they did, he has no reason to cover for Murdstone. So, how exactly was he planning on dealing with that? Planning apparently isn't much his strong suit, as a surprise visit by the Duke, who wants to see the factory as its landlord. But the Duke is one of those wealthy idiot types who are friendly enough, but easily misled and believes the lies Murdstone gives him about having the factory shut down at the moment for safety measures to be installed. This is when David meets Agnes, the Duke's daughter, and his obvious love interest. They hit it off from a shared love of reading. David finds out what a hellhole the factory is and is thrown into working immediately with another song, Welcome to My Warehouse. These songs are so very weird. They aren't particularly of any genre, they just are. The singers aren't terrible, but they're not what I'd call great either. David gets taken under the wing of a dog named Mealy, who looks like one of the ones getting kidnapped earlier, but he seems to be only a little older than David here. They spend all day working and sleep under the care of two monkeys called the Macaubers, who are actually quite kind and only pretend to act mean in front of Murdstone and his men, so no one catches on that they're actually treating the kids well. Quick question. Murdstone has been kidnapping these kids since before David was born, and obviously has continued until he grew up into a mid to late teenager. So if he's been doing this for that long, presumably he's had kids who actually aged up enough to become adults. But all of the ones that he has in his factory right now are clearly still children. The only adults in the area are the rat guards and himself and Grimby. So what happens to the kids who grow up and are no longer easily controlled? What exactly does he do with them? Why don't any of them go to the authorities or do anything to reveal what's happening here? David wants to escape, but Mealy shoots down all his plans, explaining all the different countermeasures that are in place to stop them from getting away, including the worst of all, a giant vulture called the Cheese Monster, who will hunt them down and bring them back by force. How does no one else in the entire town notice a giant frickin' vulture flying around? David decides to make the best of things until he can figure out a way to escape, using his knowledge to make the machines easier and safer to use, and coming up with ways to make the work a lot easier and faster for everyone. Which makes Murdstone angry, because even though it's more efficient, so they're producing faster, it's making the workers happy, and he thinks that'll lead to them having expectations and possibly rioting or otherwise trying to get treated better. My dude, happy workers aren't the ones that protest and riot. You should want them to be happy. But of course, he's the type that can't stand others being happy, so he wants to punish David and Mealy by locking them up in the tower, which doesn't seem all that bad, actually. I mean, it's furnished. Where David sings loud enough for the entire city to hear, apparently. Agnes sneaks into the factory, having heard the song, and sees that the workers in the factory are all enslaved children. Murdstone finds her with David and quickly removes her, but he can't really do anything to her, seeing as how her father is the Duke. However, the Duke is more concerned with his reputation and appearances, not listening to anything his daughter says about the workers being children or what's happening behind the factory gates. Clara dies, with Peggotty bringing the news to David along with Clara's will, which the Macaubers hide in a painfully obvious place where it's found almost immediately by Murdstone and Grimby. Peggotty apparently can't go to the police or anything about this or about anything that the children are enduring, as she doesn't seem to really do anything about it, and David gets locked away in the tower, again, with Mealy. Mealy tells him about how they're fattening up the cheese monster, who overhears them. Apparently, the guards are going to cook and eat the giant vulture. That would be an awful idea for many, many reasons. For one thing, she's probably quite old. Much older than any chicken or turkey you'd eat would be anyway. And for another, she's a vulture. You know that saying, you are what you eat? The diet of an animal very much affects how it tastes. A vulture that feeds on rotting carrion isn't going to taste very good, and you'd have to overcook it like mad to kill any pathogens it might carry. For another, isn't she your main method of keeping the kids trapped? Isn't she the threat that you use to keep them under control and stop them from escaping? What are you going to use as a threat without her? Unless you've got another cheese monster standing by, good luck keeping the kids from running away. Agnes shows up again, and she and David make a run for it, with Mealy helping fight off the guards, Murdstone and Grimby. The cheese monster arrives, but helps Agnes and David escape instead of capturing them, angry at the plot to eat her and showing she can talk, which adds a whole new layer to the whole gross factor of eating her. David and Agnes escape, with Peggotty and Mrs. Micawber being held prisoner, and Mr. Micawber and Mealy being thrown to the Moldies. Oh, yeah, those things. Apparently they were experimenting with different cheeses and made this kind that grows over the entire body of anyone it touches, turning them into these moaning monsters that they keep trapped in the sewers. David also has a little bird friend that's been around this whole time, but he can't really talk the way the vulture can, only tweeting in ways that only a few people seem to be able to understand. Agnes and David end up trapped near a waterfall, with Murdstone and Grimby knocking them down into the water and thinking they've killed them both. But of course, they're just fine and wash up conveniently on the doorstep of David's Aunt Betsy, who has no problem with David at all. In fact, she expresses that she's never hated him, and that Murdstone will regret laying a finger on her darling nephew that she's never met before and expressed hatreds towards at birth. You know, if you actually liked him and wanted to get to know him all this time, maybe a letter or a visit every now and again would have been in order. I mean, you could have prevented literally all of this from happening. The Duke is incredibly upset not knowing where his daughter is, with Murdstone trying to take advantage of his depressed state and get him to sign over control of the factory, but they're interrupted by Aunt Betsy arriving with David and Agnes and what looks like the full might of the police and a small army at her back. Murdstone, Grimby, and his guards are overwhelmed and taken to prison, with the children being freed. They find that the cure to the Moldies is sunlight, so getting all the kids who have been trapped in the sewers as monsters this whole time out into the sun cures them all. On Christmas, David hosts the grand opening of a new orphanage, built where the factories had stood, to house all of the orphans and give them proper homes and educations. He pairs up with Agnes, with his aunt and the Duke apparently becoming an item as well, and everybody cheers as they sing about Christmas being a family time. Now, most people familiar with the actual David Copperfield story would find this entire thing laughable, if not even offensive. It just barely touches on any of the themes Dickens tried to teach about, and it's just plain weird in a lot of ways that really didn't work for it. Weird can be good if it works with the themes and is unique enough to make it memorable, but this wasn't that kind of weird. It was just a boring kind of weird, if that makes sense. I've heard comparisons made to Oliver and Company, which, yeah, I can see why people would think that. Both based on a Charles Dickens novel and retold in a child-friendly way with cartoon animals and barely holding any resemblance to the original. Mealy even kind of takes a lot of cues from Dodger, being the cool, street-smart kind of dog who takes the unknowing, untested kitten under his wing. Maybe there is something more to those comparisons. Either way, I really wouldn't recommend this as an introduction to Charles Dickens, nor just as a movie to kill time with in general, as there are much better movies to be watching. If you want a good holiday movie to watch with anyone of any age, Klaus is a beautiful, beautiful movie. It's got a touching story, and the themes of sharing kindness are shown wonderfully, and it's become a favorite of mine even if the old Lux Theater radio show version of The Bishop's Wife is still my holiday go-to. If you want something to make fun of with your friends though, this one's a decent enough pick, and at least the animation is mostly nice, if kind of trippy in a few sequences. If you want to introduce kids to Charles Dickens, there are much better places to start than here. This one is best left where it lies, in the decaying bargain bins of old rental franchises that just barely hang on by a thread. Thank you all for joining me for another one. The holidays are a busy, stressful, and for some, emotionally taxing and draining time, so make sure to take care of yourself. Be safe, stay warm, do something small for yourself that makes you happy, even if it's just watching a silly movie with a cup of cocoa all wrapped up in a blanket, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy holidays!